The movie opens with Dalton Russell in a prison cell, confidently proclaiming his intention to execute the perfect bank robbery. The scene shifts to New York City, where a painter's van picks up several individuals dressed in painter's coveralls from various locations. The van arrives at Manhattan Trust Bank, where the group begins unloading painting equipment. Disguised as a painter, Dalton enters the bank, and a woman inside distracts the security official by talking loudly on her phone. Taking advantage of the distraction, Dalton uses the painting supplies to cover the bank's CCTV cameras. More individuals in painter's coveralls enter the bank, raising the security official's suspicion. Before the official can react, Dalton dons a mask, brandishes a weapon, and declares a siege. The robbers, using aliases like Steve, Steven, Stevie, and Stevo, deploy smoke bombs inside the bank. Outside, Sergeant Collins notices the smoke and moves to investigate. Dalton warns him to keep the police out, threatening to kill hostages if they enter. Sergeant Collins secures the area and calls for backup. Detective Keith Frazier, while on the phone with his girlfriend Sylvia, discusses a $140,000 scandal involving his name and shares his aspiration to become a first-grade detective before proposing to her. His conversation is interrupted by his boss, who assigns him as the negotiator for the bank heist. Keith and his partner, Detective Bill Mitchell, rush to the crime scene where they meet Sergeant Collins for a briefing. Mr. Arthur Case, the owner of Manhattan Trust Bank, is notified by his assistant, Catherine, about the bank robbery at his bank. Inside the bank, one of the robbers, Stevie, separates the bank employees from the other hostages. Dalton demands everyone surrender their phones and keys, but Peter Hammond resists, attempting to hide his phone. Dalton discovers his ploy and beats him, prompting another hostage, Vikram Walia, to surrender his keys and Brian to give up his video game player. Dalton forces the hostages to wear masks and coveralls identical to those of the robbers, further complicating identification. Keith collaborates with Captain Darius and requests bulletproof vests before approaching the bank. One patron, Herman Gluck, develops a heart complication and is released by the robbers. The scene shifts to post-robbery, where Keith and Billy interrogate a traumatized hostage. Meanwhile, the robbers break into the bank's safety deposit boxes, impressing Dalton. Power broker Madeline White is interrupted by her assistant, informing her of a call from Arthur Case, the owner of Manhattan Trust Bank. Arthur seeks Madeline's expertise to safeguard the contents of Safety Deposit Box 392 during the heist. Keith and Bill learn about the robbers' aliases and suspect some hostages might be perpetrators, but face multiple dead ends. Darius informs Keith and Billy about Herman and sets up communication with the robbers. Arthur meets with Madeline and assigns her the task of protecting the bank's valuable contents. Inside the bank, Steve and Stevo alternate between digging a tunnel and supervising the hostages. Billy discovers the painter's van is a ruse, and Keith attempts to contact Dalton, who ignores his calls. The robbers strap a case around Vikram's neck and send him outside. Police officers encircle him and inspect the case, finding instructions from Dalton demanding buses and jets for the hostage's release, with a threat to kill a hostage every hour until the demands are met. Arthur visits the police van, offering assistance, but he is escorted out. The robbers rotate hostages between rooms, creating confusion. One hostage begins to speak loudly and removes his mask, leading Darius to drag him into the storage room for punishment. Keith and Bill continue interrogating hostages, trying to identify the robbers. The police deliver water and pizzas with hidden listening devices, but misinterpret the language spoken as Russian. Keith calls for a translator who identifies the language as Albanian. Dalton questions Brian about his violent video game and learns Brian empathizes with the robbery. Keith brings in Elena Marisha, an Albanian speaker, who hands Keith numerous parking tickets so he can erase her penalties. Ilian also translates the bug's recording. She reveals it to be a message from a former Albanian president showing the robbers anticipated the surveillance. Dalton breaks into Safety Deposit Box 392, owned by Arthur Case, and discovers diamonds along with documents from Nazi Germany. Madeline uses her influence with the mayor of New York to arrange a meeting with Keith, convincing him to let her speak to Dalton. Keith informs Dalton about discovering his Albanian recording trick, prompting Dalton to increase his demands. Meanwhile, the robbers continue digging into the bank's storage floor. Keith and Billy interrogate more victims, but hit another dead end. Seeking more time to meet Dalton's demands, Keith solves a riddle posed by Dalton, earning extra time and a request for more food. The robbers create a sizable hole in the bank's storage room. Madeline then talks to Dalton, offering to help him receive a lighter sentence if he surrenders. Dalton reveals Arthur's collaboration with Nazis during World War II, resulting in Jewish deaths, and that he has accessed the contents of Box 392 to use as leverage. Madeline leaves the bank, remaining secretive about her conversation with Dalton when Keith questions her. Keith and Billy continue their futile attempts to interrogate hostages, but have a hard time identifying the robbers among the identically dressed hostages. Keith requests permission from Dalton to enter the bank and ensure the hostages' safety. Once inside, Keith is escorted around by Dalton. Before he leaves, he provokes Dalton intentionally to test his reactions. Another robber restrains him, and Keith concludes Dalton is not a killer. Dalton later stages a hostage execution to pressure Keith. The police and the emergency services unit plan a forceful entry using rubber bullets. Despite Billy's concerns, Keith remains optimistic about becoming a first-grade detective. A conversation with Sergeant Collins alerts Keith to the presence of bug devices, leading him to discover that the robbers have been listening to police plans via a listening device planted in the case Vikram was sent out with. Darius decides to storm the bank despite Keith's warnings. Dalton and the robbers release smoke grenades and exit the bank among the hostages. The police fire rubber bullets at the hostages until Darius calls a ceasefire. Unable to find weapons on the hostages, the police search the bank, discovering that no money or valuables were stolen, the weapons were plastic replicas, and the hostage execution was faked. With no evidence of a robbery, Keith's superior orders him to drop the case and informs him that his name has been cleared of the $140,000 scandal. Keith investigates further, finding that safe deposit box 392 has never been recorded since the bank's founding in 1948. He obtains a search warrant to open it. Madeline tries to persuade Keith to drop his investigation, hinting at Arthur's Nazi connections. Keith refuses and plays a recording of an incriminating conversation between Madeline, himself, and the mayor. Madeline fast-tracks Keith's promotion to first-grade detective and confronts Arthur, who admits to betraying a Jewish friend for diamonds during the war. Dalton's opening monologue is revealed to take place while hiding behind a fake wall the robbers built in the bank's storage room. A week after the robbery, he emerges with the contents of Arthur's box, including documents and diamonds. Bumping into Keith on his way out, Dalton goes unrecognized and exits the bank to join his conspirators. Keith finds a note in the safe deposit box from Dalton saying, "Follow the ring," along with a diamond ring. Keith confronts Arthur about safety deposit box 392 and the origin of his wealth, but Arthur remains evasive. Keith approaches Madeline at lunch, urging her to contact the Office of War Crimes Issues at the State Department about Arthur's war crimes. The movie concludes with Keith bringing home his first-grade detective certificate and finding a loose diamond, realizing Dalton slipped it into his pocket during their collision at the bank.